Okay. So, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for what is, I believe, the third webinar we are organizing this semester. Today's webinar is on the book Depletion: The Human Cost of Caring, which is Shirin Rai's award-winning book. Thank you so much for agreeing to join us, Shirin. We are really, really pleased and honored to have you as a speaker. So, for those of us who don't know your work, let me introduce you quickly. Professor Shirin Rai is Distinguished Research Professor at the Department of Politics and International Studies at SOAS University of London. She is a fellow of the British Academy, and your research interests, Shirin, lie in feminist international political economy, performance and politics, and gender and political institutions. And I remember one of the first books I read of you was on feminist political economy. And you have published extensively in these areas in journals such as World Development, International Feminist Journal of Politics, Science, Social Politics, European Journal of Politics and Gender, Review of International Studies, and New Political Economy. Your book includes Gender and the Political Economy of Development, which was published in 2004 by Polity, Performing Representations, Women Members in the Indian Parliament, which you published with Carol Sperry in Oxford University Press. You also published the Handbooks of Politics and Performance in 2021, co-edited with Gluchovic, Jestrovich, and Savard. And your latest book, Depletion: The Human Cost of Caring, was published in 2024 by Oxford University Press, and it was awarded the Susan Strange Best Book Prize by the British International Studies Association in 2025. So thank you so much for joining us, and thanks to everyone who's joining us today. This is a joint study group that we are convening with the Development Studies Association UK and the European Association of Development and Training Institute. And it is co-convened by Dr. Mihika, Chatterjee, and myself. So Mihika, do you want to say a word before we start?
I just wanted to add my thanks to Shirin for joining us and to everyone who's participating. Please carry on, Rama. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Mihika. May I ask everyone who's with us today to just mute themselves so that we can have better quality of sound. So Shirin, over to you. You have 45 minutes for your talk, and then we'll proceed with the question and answers.
Thank you, Rama, and thank you, Mihika, for organizing this and for inviting me to speak about my book. I've given this talk many times now, but it's always good for me to get responses which are always surprising, interesting, rigorous, and so I don't expect anything else today. In New Delhi, 8 women lead different lives, going about their everyday life work. One craves for friendships she has let go because she does not have enough time to invest in them. Another augments her resources through depending on her mother and mother-in-law for household help. And another still feels the relentlessness of her socially productive labor in the rhythms of her baby's needs. Meera goes walking, climbs over a fence to save 20 minutes extra walking time because the gated community that she works in has shut all gates but one, which makes her journey longer. She does this because she needs to finish her work quickly to return home to collect her children from school and to do all the household chores before helping her children with their homework and then make dinner. In Coventry, children look after parents and grandparents who are differently abled or are sick. They find some time for themselves in an NGO called, well, it's obviously anonymized, but we call it Young Carers, where 3 social workers work with them through play. The social workers are overburdened and underpaid. The parents of these children worry about the effects of the care responsibilities on their friendships, school time bullying, and homework. A community in Eastern Cape, South Africa, worries about the mining company that is about to destroy their way of life. The worry takes political form as well as cultural resistance. Violence lurks around the corner, people have been killed resisting, and the worry dissipates energy and affects everyday well-being. These are some of the stories of depletion of individuals, households, and communities discussed in the book. Why does depletion matter? Our lives and the lives of future generations are dependent on the work we call social reproduction, the reproduction of life itself, which can be and is being eroded through depletion. The concept depletion was inspired by Diane Elson's observation that care work is not endlessly elastic, as well as by the work of green economists who suggested that environmental depletion needs to be debited from the GDP. In an earlier paper, Catherine Hoskins and I outlined how unequal distribution of unpaid labor, feminized labor, and poor social infrastructure lead to depletion, which, as presented in the diagram, is at the moment unmeasured. This was a long time ago, 2007, as you can see. It's sort of, so it was the paper that Rama referred to in New Political Economy. While economists talk of the depletion or depreciation of machinery, capital goods, and the environment, they rarely talk about depletion or depreciation in terms of the household and social reproduction. This observation led us with Dania Thomas to write a paper called Depletion, the Costs of Social Reproduction, which was published in the journal International Feminist Journal of Politics in 2014, so over 10 years ago. And the book has been bubbling away in my head ever since. And so it's been a long journey, shall I say. Before outlining depletion, let me first say what I understand by social reproduction. Sometimes used interchangeably with care, social reproduction, as most of you must know, is a Marxist feminist concept that encapsulates biological reproduction, reproduction of labor, unpaid production in the home of both goods and services, social provisioning, such as voluntary work directed at meeting the needs of the community. It also includes reproduction of culture and ideology and the provision of sexual, emotional, and affective services, such as are required to maintain family and intimate relationships. Depletion then results when the outflow of social reproductive labor, such as time, energy, lack of sleep, and rest, for example, exceeds the inflow of resources, good food, shelter, rest and sleep, tipping those affected over the threshold of sustainability, which of course gestures towards what Diane Elson said about the elasticity of social reproductive labor. This is not a calculus of labor and depletion. Here, consent does not mitigate depletion, just as love does not make social reproduction less depleting. Depletion through social reproduction is a concept that also bridges the worlds of paid and unpaid work. Paid work is affected by unpaid work in the home and vice versa. So this basically is the formula that we came up with, and I'll talk about it a bit later as well, where depletion through social reproduction, DSR, is resources of in current resources when they are less than current outflows. Since the paper was written, this concept has found interdisciplinary audiences and has been used to frame the work of geographers, political economists, sociologists, and even lawyers. However, as a brief conceptual paper, it also had gaps. Issues of race, caste, and class, of environmental and social reproductive depletion were either not or only lightly touched upon. Further, the methodologies of working with the concept that we set out were rather limited. We put forward this quantitative model to assess and represent depletion, but as I found when I was researching in Delhi, this didn't quite deliver on the promise of revealing the human costs of caring. New methodologies were needed. The argument at the heart of this book is as follows. Reproduction of life doesn't just happen. It is labored over in different contexts and with differential resources unequally. In all countries, in all classes, races, religions, and cultures, women perform these labors more than men. But these women are also class, raced, and located in deeply unequal ways and therefore experience depletion in very different ways, intersectionally. Women are constantly told that their everyday labor, both paid and unpaid, to maintain the rhythms of life do not count in or as production. And yet we rely on this work every day and know that without this work, we will not survive as a global population, as a culture and community. However, as a global society, we fail to recognize this labor in our everyday lives, and we continue to deny its appropriate inclusion in discourses about work, in our national budgets, and in policy frameworks. The exploitation of this work of life-giving and its maintenance depletes lives and generates crises of care that Fraser has talked about that threatens not just livelihoods but lives. The denial of this work is institutionalized through our methodologies of accounting for work, through our ideological positioning of domestic work, through cultural and social gendered norms. Fundamentally, we continue to take this work for granted as given and costless, even as the costs of social reproduction mount up. So what does the depletion lens, together with the social reproduction lens, allows us to recognize, assess, measure, and address? First, that unequal distribution of social reproduction that leads to depletion harms those who care. This harm through depletion is multifaceted and affects everyone engaged in social reproduction, but unequally. Second, the strategies of reversing harm cannot be successful if society as a whole, states, markets, individual, non-state, and collective actors, does not acknowledge this harm in measurable ways. Further, individual strategies of mitigating harm and reversing depletion can only be limited, unequal, and indeed can intensify harm for others, such as care gaps emerging along global care chains. State intervention in addressing the unequal distribution of social reproductive work is therefore essential, if not sufficient, for replenishment as a strategy of reversal of harm. Third, a vision of a good life for all rather than for some must include human as well as planetary care. Depletion of our environment is entangled with capitalism's pursuits of cheap nature, as Jason Moore has called it, and harms ourselves and future generations. And fourth, the recognition of depletion as harm must recognize the location and histories of inequality that cast long shadows of the current care regime. Race, gender, and class are vectors of this inequality. Through focusing on depletion, then, we can begin to reveal the full costs of social reproduction, to understand the circuits of power that circulate through regimes of care and how these might be challenged and reversed. In essence, depletion fundamentally affects the material conditions of reproducing and maintenance of social life, and the struggles for reversing depletion can help us think through the transformation of social reproduction. So, as I've said, depletion harms, but how does it harm? It harms physically. We get tired, worn out, weathered, as Geronimus et al. Have called it. There's also discursive harm, harm that is about social construction of work as not including unpaid labor of social reproduction. Emotional harm, I can understand if somebody is being told every day that what they do from morning till night at home is not really of any value. And then harm to citizenship. If you think about the relationship of people with the state, of citizens with the state, and I know that citizenship is also quite a complex and not always helpful as a category in the current climate, with migration being such an important element. But what we found, and what I found when I was talking to colleagues, interlocutors, both in this Indian state as well as in Delhi, where I was researching, was that the relationship between the state and those who perform social reproduction becomes very different. It is no longer a relationship of entitlements against the state or on the state, but rather this category of people become a problem for the state as welfare recipients, right? So all of a sudden, and we know that it's not just India, it's here as well, all of a sudden, the shift takes place in the relationship between citizens and the state through what we understand citizenship to be. If you're a taxpayer, you are a good citizen. If you don't, then you obviously are a problem. Harm, therefore, can be felt at different levels: individual, household, and community, which are codependent and co-constitutive. Holding harm central to this debate is important, I think, because it reveals the multifaceted nature of depletion, as well as the ripple effects of harm and the urgency to reverse it. In essence, depletion fundamentally affects the material conditions of social reproduction and maintenance of social life, and the struggles for reversing depletion can help us think through the transformation of social reproduction. Measuring harm, though I've said we should measure it, is important, but in providing evidence to the state and to campaigning for change is not easy, rather, sorry. Let me start again. Measuring harm is not easy, but is important, I find, in providing evidence to the state and to campaign for change. It's more about, it's a kind of a form of recognition. So I'm not putting any claim on measurement as a sort of, form of truth or accuracy. Rather, it allows us to reveal and to the form of social reproductive labors and depletion that is going on. So in the original paper, as I've already said, we had outlined that model DSR is equal to RT less than the threshold, TH, where R is the current stock of resources. But when I was writing this book, I found that it was quite difficult to operationalize this model. Instead, and I can talk about that when we discuss, during Q&A, what the difficulties were. Instead, I have now attempted to show the relentlessness of social reproductive work and its cost through shadowing the time used in doing this work through a new method that I developed when I was in Delhi with Pooja Ghosh, my research assistant, and then refined and systematized with my colleague, Jackie True. And if you are interested in this, I can send you a link to it. It's open access in Warwick University. So I developed and used FHEA in Chapter 3. It allowed me to analyze depletion through recording the time used in social reproductive and paid labor by 8 women across class boundaries in one day of their lives. We find that tiredness, loneliness, and erosion of self are related to the relentlessness of social reproductive work, which is not always recognized, but often supported by families and communities. Thinking through these 8 lives was salutary for me, The micro-practices of care reveal themselves deeply embedded in structures of capitalist work regimes, as well as in everyday demands framed by cultural and social norms. FHEA, as it was called, we called it the Feminist Everyday Observatory Tool. Also allowed me to study depletion. So if you can see on the screen, this was the kind of work that we did, sort of, following this person and others, like the time use diaries would do, but instead of using time use diaries, we actually wrote it all down ourselves for various reasons, and then also took notes, took photographs with their consent, obviously, etc. So FHEA also allowed me to study depletion on the move by bringing paid and unpaid work together in the arc of everyday travel for social reproduction and for work. In chapter 4, which is on commuting, I think through how, together with unpaid social reproductive work, traveling to work is also unpaid labor that subsidizes the urban economy in neoliberal cities. Travel done over space requires not only time, thus stretching the margins of work time, but also affects the body, increased tiredness, the sense of security. Safe or unsafe travel can decrease or increase the sense of insecurity, reputations, family status, and wages. The money spent on travel could be seen as a subsidy given to employers. The state investment in physical, but not so much in social infrastructure, also affects this equation. I explored these issues through a close discussion of two stories of an Indian domestic worker, Meera, and Sangeeta, a journalist. Class divides them, but for both, their travel to work and from work increases their depletion. Methodologies need to be appropriate to the task at hand, of course. In chapter 5, I discuss how depletion moves across generations. Care of children preoccupies much of the work on caring rather than care by children. However, children also care, and their labor is also not recognized. Indeed, it is often seen to be exploitative and therefore something to be stamped out through national and international policy and legal framing. Depletion associated with this work affects children in terms of their education, levels of anxiety, friendships and exclusions, and their households in different ways. Class, race, gender, and economic policies shape the regimes of care as well as costs of care. While I could not persuade children in this study to allow FHEA, I and Annie Piroinen worked sideways in a way to study depletion effects not only on the children who care, but also on their families, and sought to understand the role that families and public institutions play in their overlooking depletion or replenishing those who care. Depletion, the book argues, is not irreversible. That would be really depressing, right? As per the original formulation of depletion, harm can be reversed, we argued in the paper, in 3 different ways: through mitigation or individual strategies, through replenishment with state and non-state support systems, and through transformation or structural change to redistribute socially productive work and its recognition at both state and international levels. Reversing depletion, like its measurement, is not easy, however, because it is anchored in structural inequalities as well as in capitalist social relations. State policy to address issues of social provisioning and welfare builds on the state's unique legal and sanctioning power regarding the production and management of gendered and racialized categories, writes V. Spike Peterson, and of gendered and minoritized groups. This, in turn, is generative of, I would argue, differentiated discriminatory practices, policies, and outcomes. So, struggles to reverse depletion, some of them are outlined in the book, take different forms, as we see in chapter 3, through individual attempts to develop networks or friendships, or laments against not being able to do so. depending upon extended family networks through strategies of self-care and needed and when needed and wherever possible, as in the Kolobeni struggle outlined in Chapter 6, through challenging and holding the state accountable through political mobilizations. Building on an examination of this protest movement, I examine in the book the depletion effects of corporate extractivist mining and through reading many of these photographs that you are seeing are from the work of the photographer Tom Pierce. I explored the idea of depletion and anticipatory harm. I argued that deep connection between gender relations, environmental extractivism, and temporalities of depletion can occur through anticipating the harm to communities and their life worlds, and through the burdens of mobilization. I also explored the legal strategies and their limitations as strategies of reversing depletion. In all these struggles, location matters. Standing in one place rather than another, whether it is along the boundaries of class or caste, let me see if I know, race or sexuality, of formal and informal work, of waged and unwaged labor, provides vistas and possibilities of social reproduction and depletion that converge as well as diverge. As Susan Ferguson has noted, it's not just what we do to reproduce society, but where we do it that counts in an imperial capitalist world. It was this insight that allowed me to then think about how do we go about pluralizing social reproduction theory. That's another story. You'll have to ask me back for that. If location is taken seriously, the family form, as well as the understanding of production and social reproduction, and the place of labor and work in capitalism would have to be rethought, as would then the consequent different forms of depletion. If the binary that is generated in the global north between productive and reproductive realms is not always sustainable in the global south, then different forms of depletion become relevant to our discussion. Global care chains illustrate this point very well. The care labor needed by aging population of the global north elicits this labor from around the global south, leading to deficits of care labor in countries supplying this labor. Without decentering the analysis of social reproduction and through it of depletion, a north-centric approach can also undermine efforts to build solidarities across laboring classes. I would suggest that depletion as a concept also decenters. Focusing on the costs of social reproduction allows for light to be cast on relationships that invoke love as well as pain, joy as well as exhaustion, solidarity as well as exploitation. Depletion decenters middle-class notions of care that obfuscate complexity of the labor of care by revealing the circuits of power in which social reproduction is enmeshed, which depletes individuals, households, and communities with different intensity, leaving significantly diverse roots out of it, depending on their socioeconomic locations. The book was written largely during a crisis, the COVID pandemic. But of course, this is not the only crisis that has been impinging on my work and the lives of so many. Other crises, environmental, financial, political, social, have all seen the intensification of depletion as people struggle to resource social reproduction with racialized and gender division of labor, making life work difficult. Crises are therefore historically layered. The pandemic struck when regimes of austerity, of racism, and precarity were already operative, intensifying the crisis of social reproduction and intensifying depletion. All crises have this potential of differentially intensifying depletion of those who have to cope every day with the constrained lives that crises produce. However, some crises challenge the very concept, I feel, given what's happening in the world today, the very concept of depletion. Here, I want to acknowledge that we are discussing social reproduction and depletion in the shadow of a genocide that has happened in Gaza and where it's beginning to take shape in Lebanon. The unimaginable roll call of loss in Gaza makes me stop short. This is not depletion, but a catastrophic collapse of social reproduction. And I just felt that I needed to flag this because for me, this catastrophe is not captured through what we have been talking about, which is depletion. And yet, as a colleague of mine, Ali Mazadri, said to me, she said, "Oh, yes, but if it is layered, then depletion was in the background already in a very intense way before this catastrophe came about." So finally, and in summary, depletion, I would say, is not a very cheery or optimistic concept. However, as I look back to the life stories of individuals, households, and communities covered in this book, I find much to be hopeful about. It is because despite the challenges of the or mal-recognized social reproductive work, despite balancing care work with paid work under conditions of class disprivilege, we find in these communities struggling against the structures of everyday exploitation, imagining different lives and coming together in friendship and solidarity to try and reverse their own and their community's depletion, present and anticipated. How much time do I have? Like, I've got just 2 minutes.
You have up to 10 more minutes.
Oh my goodness. I think I'll be done before that.
Perfect.
So prefigurative approaches to change, such as Gibson Graham's work, Davina Cooper's work, Nicola Yates's work, are being mobilized to reimagine both care and caring such that those who care do not suffer continuing depletion of and through this work. However, these prefigurative imaginaries are also embedded in long histories of gender, class, and race oppressions and locations. Issues not only for recognition, but of redistribution are therefore needed to be raised and are raised in the book. State and non-state actors have a role to play in these reimaginings, but they also do this within the constraints of the historical structures of empire and of capitalism. So in conclusion, in the conclusion, I discussed these some of these prefigurative reimaginings that translate into local struggles and why some of them are more successful than others, which opens up new avenues of reshaping social reproduction in the everyday at the 3 levels discussed in the book: mitigation, replenishment, and transformation. In writing this book, I had 2 objectives: mapping and revealing the intensity and extensity of the problem of depletion, and secondly, to examine and reflect on how it affects our ecologies at individual, household, and community levels, and how struggles to reverse it are taking place in different modes and at different levels. The book, then, is a plea to recognize the costs of social reproduction and to stop the harm to ecologies of life-making and its flourishing through mobilizations of new imaginaries and activism that are both reflexive and sustainable. Reversing depletion is urgent and demands a solidaristic and transformative approach to world-making. And I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Shirin, for this insightful presentation of your book. I think those of us who haven't read it can buy it. They can also engage with it more thoroughly. But before anyone asks a question, maybe I had a question about your writing process for the book, because I realized.
Sorry, Rama.
Yes.
Are you still seeing my screen?
Yes, I can still see it. You can stop sharing if you wish.
Yeah, I don't know how, I don't know how to stop sharing. I would like to, but what do I do to stop sharing it?
There should be a button just below your screen. Can you see it?
It says, has it gone now?
I can still see it. Mihika, can you see it still?
Yeah,
Yes,
hang
I
on,
can
hang on.
still
I
see
think
it.
remove. No, it
I can
says
see it.
share settings, host tools. Sorry about this, guys.
No
No,
worries.
I know I've done this before, but I can't seem to do anything. Presenter layout, and then because I want to see people when they're talking, and I don't want the screen in my face.
I'm trying to find,
Content only background, share sound.
because I'm on my phone. Maybe you can spotlight Shirin, Mihika,
I'll
because
do
I'm
that.
not co-host right now. I'm not co-host, and I'm on the phone.
Mihika, can you help, please?
Yeah, I'm just going to
If you can. This is all very odd.
but I think even if I spotlight, unless and until Shirin stops sharing her screen, that's not going to be
Oh, should I just
if you there's a
close? Should I just close my?
yeah, if you just close, exactly. I was just going to say, just if you just hit escape from your
Okay.
screen, and that might allow.
Okay. So then what do I do now? This meeting is being recorded.
You
Okay.
should see if you click under
Stop share.
share.
I needed to be
Yeah,
there.
okay,
Oh,
great.
it's okay.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you. Sorry about that.
And Rama, I've made you co-host
And
again.
Rama has got a
Hopefully
question
you
now,
should
I
be able
think.
to. Yeah.
Focus on.
Thank you so much, Mihika, and it's great to be able to see you now. So before I ask my question, I think I'll save it as a moderator. I let anyone in the conversation who has a question come in. Please do unmute yourself or raise your hand if you want to ask a question to Shirin about her book. Okay, so I don't see any hands, so I'll ask my question. I wanted to ask you about the process for writing this book, because I see you are very much inspired by, literature, things that are very artistic, let's say, non-academic. And because I see you have cited Annie Ernaux, the feminist writer. You cited Maya Angelou, her poetry, women's work. And I really wanted to ask you, how does that nourish your work? And also the quotidian, I see the daily moments of life that lead you to reflect more thoroughly and to produce theory about social reproduction and depletion. So as a feminist, I wanted to ask you, as a feminist and as an academic, how much are we not allowed, because we are not waiting to be allowed, but how much has that writing process been for you, and what has nourished you through the writing? I think it's a simpler question before we start on the more
I'm not sure it's a simple question, Rama, but it is a really important question, and especially for those of us who are you're quite right. We are disciplined to write in a particular way. And I'm old enough and senior enough now to be able to say, no, that's not my voice. There have been others who have done the same thing. If you look at the work of Jenny Atkins, for example, and sort of so many other feminists. But largely, you're quite right. We are disciplined to write in a particular way, to reference in a particular way, and that is reflected for me in the phrase, which in English, it is like one of the worst phrases, but it's so revealing, which is curiosity killed the cat, right? Don't show curiosity unless it is about in a very narrow register. So, and I'm kind of probably a bit of a rebel always, so but I've also always enjoyed poetry. To read it, to write it, to think about it. It captures so much in so few words. And I don't think that this book would have had the readership it has now if it hadn't been for the fact that I really wanted to communicate with people rather than impress them. So I hope that you're picking up on things that are there in the book, but also that, I mean, how do I talk about, Selma James, for example, in terms of, they start with a poem about free labor. How do I not sort of talk about slavery without Cohambi Collective talking, in their, and actually Bernice Reagan's one statement has always stayed with me. And she said, mobilizing is tiring, right? That is our third burden. And so unless we read widely, and if we are talking about the everyday and theorizing the everyday, I don't think it's possible without taking our everyday seriously.
Thank you so much, Shirin. And I think we will come back to that, the feminist school of observation. We have a question from Bhupendra, who's asking, thanks, Shirin, for such a wonderful conversation and book presentation. Congratulations. Could you please elaborate more on the conditions for reversing depletion in the capitalist imperialist world today? That's a question. You can see it in the chat box.
I can. I just saw that. Thank you, Bhupendra, for this question, which is not going to satisfy, the answer is not going to satisfy you. It doesn't satisfy me. If you're coming from a position where at the heart of all this is capitalism, then of course, the only thing we can say is that social reproduction needs to get rid of reversing social reproduction means that we reverse capitalism, right? But we also know from history, not so much in terms of, well, colonial history maybe, but no, I'm talking about more so-called progressive history of socialism and state socialism, that getting rid of capitalism did not get rid of the problems of depletion. And the subsidy that social reproduction provides, the state. So in that context, unless we all get together and say, we are going to get rid of capitalism today, the only thing we can do is to still challenge and form different strategies to at least minimize depletion, if not reverse it entirely. Now, two forms that we can think about, and again, it depends on your politics, which one you choose. One is to think about utopia and utopic studies as the prefigurative studies as a way of not just thinking about alternatives, but also acting as if those alternatives are possible here and now. That could be in terms of collective cooking. That could be, if you read Davina Cooper's book, it's called Everyday Utopias, I think. It's now, I think, in 2008, 9, something like that. She gives many such examples of collectives forming. If you read Silvia Federici's wonderful book, if you haven't read it, you must read it, called Re-Enchanting the World, she gives examples from Kenya about women's collectives and food production, right? We can see some of that glimmer through even old-fashioned ways of coming together, which is what are they called here in the UK? What are they called? When you can get a piece of land and then you can, oh God, my brain's gone completely. Anyways, there are different forms of collectives that we can think about and act on. So it doesn't have to be, sorry?
Allotments.
Allotments. Thank you very much. Allotments. But obviously that's not something that is sustainable over time under conditions that we have. Allotments are everywhere under threat because land is so expensive and land for housing is so expensive, alternative uses of land. Also, things like collectives, cooking and etc. Not easy because, again, of no sustaining of this long term across boundaries of class and race, right? Families come together to help each other, as I've said. That was something that my point here is, and then there's unionization of work, which is so difficult for social reproductive laborers and laborers, right? So my point here is that if we can all say we want to work towards overthrowing capitalism and bringing about socialism, informed by feminist work on social reproduction, not just on production. But we need to also have some idea of change as a bundle of measures, not as one thing, but as a bundle of measures. Now, feminists are very good about doing this, despite what Nancy Fraser says, handmaids of capitalism, liberal feminists, fine. But the fact remains that if we are going to take the everyday seriously, then improving our everyday, not by exploiting other women through mitigation, through buying in labor of other poorer women, but by campaigning and making claims on the state to develop social infrastructure much more than it does, and also mobilizing against backlash. I mean, think of how I always am astonished at how quickly things begin to unravel under conditions of crisis. Whether that crisis is financial or, think of the pandemic and how we all stood outside and, clapped for the carers. And everybody, all feminists were writing, at least liberal feminists were, that, this means that care is finally going to have a real recognition and no, it didn't. So I think I would say that in terms of conditions for reversing depletion, the conditions are not very promising right now. And yet, we can't give up. And that is why I didn't have time to think about, but I end the book by talking about what sort of solidarity do we want? And that solidarity really needs to be reflexive in the sense that we need to understand each other's positionality and also to see this balance between structural change and the immediate change. As I said, I bet this doesn't answer your question and you are dissatisfied, but so am I. But thank you for asking it.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you so much. Thank you so much. I think we saw a hand from Hisaye, but I'm not sure if they are still connected. Do we have other questions?
No, Rama, I don't see Hisai, and I don't see a question in the chat from Hisai, that is.
Yes, she had a hand. That's why she's not
Yes,
on the
but I
call.
didn't think Hisai is online anymore. I had seen the hand as well, but I don't think Hisai. Hisai, are you online? I don't see you. Well, in that case, shall we move on to others, Rama?
Yes. Do we have other questions? Please raise your hand or even comments. Please raise your hand and unmute yourself. So Mihika, is it you? You have a question?
Yes, if no one else has, then I will, jump in if that's all right. Again, thank you, Shirin, so much. Obviously, it was very thought-provoking, and I'm really looking forward to reading your book. And perhaps you cover some of what I'm going to ask in the book, and possibly you've been asked this before. But I was just wondering a little bit about the point that you had made about methodologically pluralizing the idea of social reproduction, and a part of what you said also involved thinking about the measurement aspect of depletion and finding a way to communicate harm through the measurement. I was just wondering that in the current political conjuncture of right-wing populist governments, if we were, and perhaps you have a different way of theorizing what you mean by measuring depletion, but if we were to think of measures of social reproduction and how we augment, say, GDP figures or any other official statistics with the idea of social reproduction, and suddenly regimes begin to see that there is, a labor that women perform within the realm of the household and within the confines of the physical home, that and they begin to valorize it through very patriarchal norms. Is there a risk under the current political conjuncture of this being weaponized to keep women at home by valorizing their labor in particular ways through these measurements? So that's one question I had. And the second one was that you asked us that we could ask you how your work, how you're thinking about pluralizing social reproduction. So if you could give us a few insights on what we ought to be thinking about for future research agenda, that would be great. Thank you.
Thank you. And if I may just add to Mihika's last question. How does pluralizing social reproduction allow us better theorize depletion across transnational spaces? Because what we are seeing happening here in the UK, India, and I believe Senegal and other contexts are really similar with the rise of austerity. So how do we theorize across transnational spaces in a way that challenges state-centric approaches? Thank you.
Thank you. Mihika, I forgot to say in my response to Bhupendra that one of the really exciting initiatives just now is in Latin America, where the idea of the popular economy has taken root, and the Colombian National Plan, I think it was 2022, if I can remember right, has actually acknowledged the importance of this work and has taken measures to support domestic labor. Now, there are lots of arguments that we can have, and I do have questions because I don't know this work very well. It's just kind of come to my attention that actually we could be talking about sort of, helping women do this labor, absorbing them into the national labor force, but not redistributing responsibility at home, right? But at least that's not the discourse that they are framing it with. They are framing it with that this is a labor for all of us. We should all do it, and this needs supporting properly rather than just not recognizing it. So there is that sense, and it's a left-wing government, and therefore it is interesting. I would follow this sort of more carefully. But of course, you are right. And that was something not just, again, about right-wing governments or right-wing populists, but also, do you remember sort of, well, you won't remember, you're too young. But when the wages for household debate came up, one of the criticisms was that does it not trap women into being the domestic worker, right? If you are being paid for domestic work, does that mean that you're redistributing that work? No. And also, in a way, you could increase dependence. And their argument was very similar to my argument, that what we are saying is not about individual strategies of, but it is about recognition of that labor. And that is where, even though they didn't do that, but feminist economists took that up and said, well, that doesn't work for us. But what does work for us is a kind of institutionalized recognition through the GDP. The GDP, I don't know how much, I find it exciting. It's very boring, or can be very boring, I'm sure, for so many people, is something that I got very interested in when I read Marilyn Waring's book, which was published very long time ago now, 1988, called If Women Counted. And she herself was a statistician, and she was raging against, really, this book is such, so full of rage that the way in which the GDP is calculated is that the unpaid domestic labor is outside what is called the production boundary. And the production boundary is about markets and market price. So criminal activity can be part of our GDP, but not unpaid domestic labor. And she just could not believe that we were thinking that this is an okay thing. And of course, there is a geopolitics attached to this, because this way of thinking about, what's his name? Kuznets? Yeah. About GDP and how that is to be calculated was then globalized in 1990 after the collapse of the Soviet Union, because then it was part of that whole thing of we have won, right? That capitalism is the end of history. Now, what we, the West, were doing is to be globalized. And so the UN was complicit in that rolling out of what is called this SNA, system of national accounts, which now all governments across the world have to use if they are to be recognized in terms of the GDP being accurate. And this, of course, also links politically to what I was saying, which is about citizenship, right? If you are outside the production boundary, you are not contributing to the economy. You are not being reflected in the GDP figures. And therefore, the state can say, hey, you're a burden on the economy, get working, because that's what's happening in India just now. There is a great deal, sort of, as some of you might know, great deal of concern that Indian women's participation in the labor force, in the labor market, is only, I think, 26% or so, right? And that's a problem. And then I think, well, it might be a problem for you, but it's not a problem for them because they're doing so much work which is not being counted. So I think it's not just a right-wing problem. It is for us to make that a left-wing issue. So that was that. About PSRA, which is pluralizing social reproduction approaches. So I think this was the pandemic. We were all, weren't we, alone in our little homes. And I was reading Tithi Bhattacharya's excellent book on social reproduction theory, and increasingly feeling that there are things here where, because it is so reflective of global North economies and societies, I just found that there were gaps there. I mean, it's a very strong book. It's a very strong articulation of SRT. But I felt that, and then I read this line, which is also in the same book by Susan Ferguson, which is that not only what you do, but where you do it counts, right? And that really resonated with me. So what would happen if social reproduction theory included land as a key factor in our understanding, right? Both of you work on land, you and Rama. So not just in terms of who owns land. So there's a lot of work, field of my own, starting with Beena Agarwal's work, but also debt and how is that connected? You could have issues around labor, the length of time spent on the land. You have issues about identity and subjectivity attached to the land. If we were to take land seriously, as actually in the majority world, it still is, despite the fact that in countries like India, you've got no primogeniture, which means then land is being subdivided. it also is generative of a different politics, right? So you could be thinking about social reproduction theory in a very different way, or at least including different aspects of social reproduction and therefore of depletion in our analysis. And now, I'm very lucky, sort of, that I'm part of a feminist community. So I just picked up the phone and talked to a few people: Alexandra Mazadri, Sara Stevano, Hannah Bargawi, my own colleagues at Warwick, Juanita Elias, etc., etc. We were about 10 of us. And I said, would you like to read this book together? Am I just being really pernickety? Is everything okay in the world? And I'm just not happy because there's COVID and I'm alone. And everyone said yes, which was amazing. And we met once a week. No, once a month. What am I saying? They were not that generous. But once a month we met and we discussed different papers. We discussed our ideas. And from there, we started thinking. But one of the things we were aware of very early was that we did not want to fight with the SRT gang, It was just like opening it up to scrutiny in a most sort of solidaristic way. And therefore, we didn't want to also say that we are now developing a new theory of social reproduction. We are not. We are building on what the work has been done, but developing different approaches. So that is why the network that emerged from this is called Pluralizing Social Reproduction Approaches. So how do we approach social reproduction and it's, through different locations? And location, obviously, as geographers will tell us endlessly, is not just about place, it is also about social relations. So I think that's where it started, and we had a very exciting workshop and wrote a paper, a collective paper with 15 people, which was published in the International Feminist Journal of Politics in 25, called Pluralizing Social Reproduction Approaches. And so if you are interested, I can send you that to your group. Sorry, Rama, what was your question? I've forgotten. I forgot to write it.
It's the same question. I was asking about the methodology of doing so in transnational concepts, not only measuring, but also, generating that theory which could be relevant in those specific transnational contexts. That was my question. But I think as you referred to that new publication of yours, 2025 publication, we will direct everyone to that publication. I think you have been overly generous with your time. We are now over 15 almost minutes past 3. Thank you so much for being our guest speaker today. Mihika and I have been deeply inspired, and I think other feminist political economists or political scientists or academics that are with us today have been deeply inspired by your work. And we wanted to tell you how important you are to all of us. So thank you so much.
Thank you,
Do you have
Rama.
any
That's so kind.
Yeah.
Yeah, that is really kind. And I just also wanted to say, not that I have a paper in it, but I'm editing together with Stephanie Wohl. I already told you a special issue of Social Politics, the journal, on pluralizing social reproduction theory, in which we look at exactly those kind of examples and then theorize or try and theorize from that. So do keep an eye out for it. It'll be out in the next 6 months or so, I think. Thank you so much, and goodbye.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you, Rama, for chairing.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.